Please.
Good morning, Ms Gardner.
Good morning. My lady, the first witness today is Karen Bailey.
Just repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please could you state your full name for the inquiry?
Alice Karen Bailey.
Ms Bailey, you've given 3 witness statements to the inquiry, 2 in your capacity as corporate witness for BSO PaLS, and 1 in your capacity representing the Counter Fraud and Probity Service. Those are dated the 17th of January 2025, the 12th of February 2025, and the 2nd of December 2025. Are those statements true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Ms Gardner, there's one small amendment that I'd like to make in relation to the information that was supplied to the Competition and Markets Authority.
We'll perhaps get that up. That is from your corporate statement, INQ 000514103 and paragraph 190. Thank you. Is that the paragraph you're referring to?
That is, Ms Gardner, and just to confirm that there was a query about the submission of this to the CMA, and that was provided last night, and we've done a quick check and found a copy of the details, but what we can't establish that is if that was submitted to the CMA, and we're currently investigating that at the moment, and we'll follow that up in due course with the inquiry.
Thank you. So that will be that clarification will be taken into account, and any further witness evidence that you want to provide by means of a supplemental statement will also be taken into account. I want to first ask you about your role. You are the Chief Executive of the Business Service Organisation, and I note that you say in your witness statement that you were appointed to that role in June 2020, but you are willing to speak and familiar with the events prior to that in your capacity as a corporate witness.
That's correct.
Could you briefly explain what the Business Service Organisation is?
So the Business Services Organisation is an organisation that provides professional and shared services to the wider health and social care community in Northern Ireland. We were established under statute in 2009 to provide those services as an arm's length body of the Department of Health.
And you've provided your witness statements in relation to 2 services within the Business Services Organisation, BSO Procurement and Logistics Services, which we've referred to as BSO PaLS, and BSO Counter Fraud and Probity Services. We're going to discuss primarily BSO PaLS today. And you say in your witness statement that BSO PaLS is a centre of procurement expertise for the health and social care system in Northern Ireland. Can you explain what that is and what BSO PaLS' role is in the health and social care system?
Okay. So, Centre of Procurement Expertise, in terms of procurement, that's a devolved matter to Northern Ireland through the Minister of Finance, and there are a number of what we call COPEs, Centre of Procurement Expertise, that are aligned to the departments in Northern Ireland, and that the central one of those would be the Construction and Procurement Directorate, who is responsible for setting procurement policy. And they disseminate out, if you like, the procurement policy notes to all departments.
And that's within the Department of Finance.
And that's within the
Yes.
Department of Finance. What then is, so there's seven COPEs, as I say, and BSO PaLS is one of those centres of procurement expertise. So they would work with all the health and social care organisations in terms of sourcing, in terms of procurement, in terms of warehousing and logistics for the various health and social care organisations that we support, and all the main trusts, for example, would be part of that. We would also support Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Services through that COPE.
And looking first at the sort of service that you're providing and that direction of things, you've said that you provide health and social care trusts, and are all health and social care organisations in Northern Ireland required to use BSO PaLS for their procurement?
Yes, that would be the direction that they would come through PaLS for their advice, for their sourcing and procurement.
And do any trusts ever carry out any direct procurements as well?
Yes, I think it's my understanding that they may do occasionally do direct procurements, generally with advice from PaLS.
And in relation to the lines of accountability, who is BSO PaLS accountable to in terms of departments? Okay,
so I suppose the relationship I've described there through the permanent secretary and the, if you like, and the COPE status is very much a professional line, and in terms of policy, procurement policy coming through. But and I describe that, if you like, then as two lines. So that's through that line, but they've also then got the organisational line through BSO, which is through myself as accountable officer to the permanent secretary in health, and that's very much around the accountability for service delivery and performance.
So in terms, is it fair to sum it up in this way? In terms of service delivery, and that is providing suitable and sufficient healthcare equipment and supplies for the health and social care system, that line of accountability goes all the way up to the Minister for Health.
Yes.
And then in terms of application of good procurement policy,
Absolutely.
It goes all the way up to the Minister for Finance.
It would go to the Perm Sec, and that's operationalised through our sponsor branch arrangements with the Department of Health. So we would be in discussion with them about operationalising policy and delivery.
Thank you. You've already mentioned that health and social care in Northern Ireland in your statement involves the supply of goods to social care providers. Does that expand to, prior to the pandemic and outside the pandemic, does that expand to private providers of social care, or only those run directly by health and social care trusts?
Yes, under the legislation that established us, we were only able, and we are only able, to actually supply to health and social care organisations, and in that context it would be social care that is actually directly provided by those health and social care providers. We would not have had a remit to supply to private sector or independent sector providers.
And I think we'll get later on to the point in the pandemic when that remit was expanded to independent service providers and the effect that that had. First, though, I wanted to bring you to paragraph 33 of your witness statement. here you discuss what you call the electronic materials management system. Sorry, this is at page 14 of your first witness statement. Thank you. What is the purpose of the EMM?
So EMM is this electronic materials management system that effectively works at ward level and at theatre level in the trusts, and effectively allows an inventory management approach whereby 24 days of stock is handled through that system and stored at the ward level. And automatically, when the usage gets to a point, there's a trigger at 12 days for an automatic trigger going back to our warehouse management system in our central distribution points to replenish the stock at the acute and the ward and the theatre level.
So was this system in place throughout the pandemic?
It was initially, at the start of the pandemic, it was in use. However, at a point in the pandemic, it was superseded by the push arrangements out to the trust organisations. So that's very much based on the pull model and being able to automatically replenish. But ultimately, that was replaced during the pandemic by push arrangements.
But regardless of whether you're pulling, the system is pulling items to the hospitals or wards or theatres, or you're pushing them proactively, is it right that this gives you, BSO PaLS, visibility over stock levels in trusts?
No, I think it's important to clarify. So when it did move to the push system, that was through a central hub arrangement at the trust levels. So that actually took precedence over individual acute arrangements. There wouldn't have been that automatic. The trust hubs would have been coordinating right across at the PAN level and not really allowing acute wards just to automatically replenish at that point.
Mm-hmm. And what level of visibility does BSO PaLS have today over stock levels in wards and trusts?
Well, it would revert it back at this point now to the EMM system.
I want to look, thank you, we can have that off the screen. I want to look next at stockpiles and preparedness. Can you tell us who has responsibility for the PIP stockpile in Northern Ireland?
So the PIP stockpile is managed in our warehouses through, it's a service level agreement with the Department of Health. Kept separately and procured separately from our main stock in the warehouse, and that's through the lines of the Department of Health, the Emergency Preparedness team in the Department of Health.
And who makes decisions about what sort of things you keep in the PIP stockpile?
At the start of the pandemic, that's very much a national decision and pushed out to the devolved nations.
So that would have been DHSC.
So that would have been DHSC at that point, yeah.
And apart from the PIP stockpile, which you give further details of in your statement, what sort of preparedness or business continuity plans did BSO PaLS have in place for the type of emergency which it faced in January to March 2020?
The business continuity plans that would have been in place at that point would have primarily been concerned with loss of facilities, loss of systems, probably over a much reduced period of time. So it would have been more about short, sharp shocks to the system rather than what we faced, if you like, over a very long, protracted period of time in COVID. They had been updated and refreshed by a lived experience, I suppose, of dealing with the Brexit preparations as well. So there was definitely experiences with that had informed the continuity plans, but nothing of the nature, if you like, of what we faced over the COVID period.
And those preparations that you mentioned in relation to the EU exit, did they anticipate any form of supply chain disruption?
They did. Obviously, Northern Ireland in a very unique position when it came to planning for Brexit and some of the very important considerations to do with, obviously, without straying into political territory, but the border situation and how we might deal with any disruption across borders, and also certifications, for example, in terms of products coming across. EU certifications, for example, how those would be treated. So there was probably unique things that Northern Ireland faced in terms of preparing, if you like, for Brexit, and certainly part of that involved building up stocks, if you like, prior to the Brexit situation. We would also have been involved in Four Nations planning with the Brexit, on the Brexit situation with the other devolved administrations. So that would have also refreshed into our continuity planning as well.
But there was no planning specific to supply chain disruption as part of planning for a future pandemic or health emergency?
Well, we would have been definitely thinking about how we would have got freight through and those kind of issues.
You also mention in your statements the standard contract terms used by BSO PaLS at this point, and you say that there were variation clauses built in so that you could vary quantities of healthcare equipment and supplies that you had ordered in line with growth, usual business as usual growth. But these were not suitable for surges in demand, such as you had with COVID. You say that BSO PaLS was not commissioned or requested to build in those kind of clauses. Was this something that BSO PaLS could have foreseen, given the preparations that had been put in place for EU exit, swine flu, or indeed a future pandemic?
I think the sense was that the variation in clauses provided enough capacity in terms of the Brexit planning. In terms of COVID, I think it goes on further to say in the statement that even where we could possibly have had surge clauses in the contracts, it would have been very highly unlikely that suppliers could have committed to those surge clauses anyway. So there was a sense of, yes, you could have put it into contracts, but the reality was that suppliers may not have been able to meet them.
Thank you. I want to again refer to something that you said in your witness statement. I don't think we need it up. I'll just read it. But at paragraph 8, you say that prior to COVID, BSO PaLS enjoyed productive, mutually beneficial relationships with 3 key organisations. And you set out that those organisations are NHS Supply Chain as a customer, and also with the other devolved administrations, Wales and Scotland, because you had a long established practice of joint contracting. And presumably that was so you could benefit from economies of scale and a greater degree of contacts and product volumes at that point. Is that correct?
Yes, very, very close and positive relationships is really the sense. And as I say, we had a number of joint contracting initiatives, such as a radiology framework with supply chain, etc., that it was about economies of scale, in effect. And there would also have been a great sharing of soft market intelligence that went on as well.
And how did those relationships change at the outset of the pandemic?
So in terms of how they changed, the Four Nations group that would have been dealing with Brexit, if you like, transitioned into what was known as the WN COVID group, and that was chaired by DHSC, and that group then met really from January on for a period of months to discuss the collective response to COVID. And it was really at that point, fairly early on, that we realised that supply chain was struggling from an early point to actually supply to us. We would have got a lot of our FFP3 masks and cleaning products, if you like, through supply chain. So there was a definite sense that that was going to be an area of concern for us.
What proportion of your PPE, and particularly you mentioned FFP3 masks, would you have procured from supply chain, NHS supply chain, prior to the pandemic?
My understanding was most of the FFP3 masks would have been, the 3M masks would have been sourced through supply chain.
And what about other forms of PPE that you needed for the pandemic?
Other forms of PPE, we actually had, that wasn't supplied nationally. So we actually had strong local contracting arrangements ourselves. We had set up arrangements primarily with UK and Ireland suppliers. So we had our own contracts for the other areas.
But almost all FFP3 masks and cleaning products came through NHS supply chain, is that right?
Supply chain, yeah.
And when did it become apparent that that route of supply was going to be insufficient?
My understanding is that became evident fairly early on in the first surge.
I want to bring up INQ 000446232. If you can go to page 2. Thank you. This is a document that you produced, exhibited to your witness statement, and it is dated June 2020, titled Supply Chain Strategy PPE Products. And here you set out a variety of options for dealing with the supply chain disruption that you faced at this point, and the pros and cons of doing so. The first is to maintain local stock holding at 4 weeks with just-in-time weekly deliveries. I understand that that is the system that you had in place prior to the pandemic. Is that right?
That reflected business as usual arrangements, if you like.
And you set out underneath that that is not going to be a particularly useful option, has already failed to deliver what the health and social care system need at that point.
Correct.
Option 2 that you set out is to outsource PPE supply to Supply Chain Coordination Limited and Clipper Logistics. So that's NHS supply chain. And you note, and this is further down at page 3, that this was a high-risk option due to the lack of control HSE would have over supply of PPE. Is this reflective of a lack of confidence at this point in NHS supply chain to deliver quantities of PPE?
I think that's a fair comment.
Yeah. And then the final option, and I believe this is the one that was adopted, is to maintain local stock holding at 12 weeks with just-in-time weekly deliveries. And it is noted that this provides stability and resilience, but also the disadvantage is cost.
That's correct.
Is it right to say, however, that at that point, that was the only real option available to BSO PaLS for managing the PPE crisis that it found itself in?
I believe so. At this point, we had been involved in mutual aid discussions with the other devolved administrations, and while there was some small quantities of PPE coming primarily through NHS England and through Wales. It was of small quantities. There was a sense that I think we'd had some experiences with the NHS England thing where, the mutual aid just wasn't able to be confirmed, or we couldn't rely. There was it really was that lack of confidence that if we were dependent on that, we wouldn't be in a good, strong position locally.
And if I can also get up INQ 000 436 300. Thank you. And I think we need to go on to the next page. Oh, excuse me, sorry. I was wrong, it was on the previous page. This is an email from Michael McBride, who is the Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland, and this is sent in April 2020. He has been in conversations with NHS England, Keith Willett, last night. This conversation is about release from Northern Ireland's PIP stockpile of, I believe, gowns to as mutual aid to other devolved nations. However, he also comments on incoming PPE via NHSE, and it's that comment that I want to ask you about. He says that there are concerns that the DHSC stock anticipated may be of variable quality, and the timeframe for delivery is indicative. Does that reflect your experience with NHSE or BSO PaLS experience at this time?
Certainly, in terms of supply chain, yes, that would reflect the fact that we had, not so much I think about variable quality, but the fact that we knew supply chain was under great pressure. In terms of that PIP stockpile, I think it's important to point out that we didn't release the PIP stockpile all at once. At the start of the pandemic, it was actually used as a bridge, if you like, to supplement any gaps or where we were getting particularly low. So it was actually used as a kind of reserve. That worked very well for us in terms of the pandemic. So in terms of mutual aid, there was a sense that where possible, we should be trying to support, and equally, we got some back. So decisions about what was released out of the stockpile would have been very much at the CMO level.
Thank you. And you say in your witness statement that your relationships in general with the other devolved administrations strengthened in this period with information sharing, increased contact, and also provision of mutual aid. I wanted to ask you about something that a previous witness said in their evidence. Mr. Tim Losty, who has already given evidence to this module, he said in his evidence that at times he felt as though the UK government was disinterested in working with the devolved administrations, or did not take sufficiently seriously the concerns of the devolved administrations. Is that something that was reflected in your experience?
I would be speculating, Ms. Gardner, not having been there firsthand, I would be speculating at that point.
That's fine if it's not something you're able to comment on.
I can't comment on
we
that.
can't take that any further. But to sum up the position in the spring of 2020, you had been relying for these essential items of PPE, in particular FFP3 masks, very heavily on NHSE. It came to light that was not going to be a substantial route of procurement anymore. And so Northern Ireland was put in a place where it was going to have to do much more direct procurement. And I want to go to the process that was undertaken by BSO PaLS at that point. You say that you had three main approaches. BSO PaLS had three main approaches. One was use of previous contractors and suppliers. One was sourcing proactively, those new suppliers, including local manufacturers. And the other was following up contacts and leads that were being referred to you directly or through third parties such as ministers, MLAs, MPs, senior civil servants. How were the third category of contacts that were referred to you, how were those dealt with?
So those would have come in a variety of different ways. We would have had people sending information into the trusts, into a mailbox that the department set up, a PPE mailbox, directly into PaLS itself. There was a real sense of, and I know others have said that as well, a real deluge of this information coming into the system. As that came into PaLS, a triage process was set up, and that effectively logged initial contacts. And then there was a more rigorous follow-up process followed up with them in terms of getting further information, a form that those people had to actually fill out, given details. We had a separate, we had structured ourselves at that point into category teams, dealing specifically with the different areas of PPE internally. And because FFP3 was probably our biggest risk area, there was that triage process, there was the bit that dealt with the rest, and then bit that dealt with that priority FFP3 masks route. And that they would have obviously been the first that we were trying to deal with in terms of sourcing.
And you mentioned in your witness statement a call that was published by the Department of Finance Construction Procurement Delivery Organisation for suppliers of, among other things, PPE. And this was advertised on the eTenders website and then later on NI Direct. Was BSO PaLS asked whether that call to arms, if I can put it that way, was necessary or useful? Was anyone asked about that from a procurement perspective?
I wouldn't have the detail of that, Ms. Gardner, I'm sorry.
Very good. I want to bring up INQ 000498735. Thank you. And if you can have slide 2. Yes, this is slide 2. This is a slide deck from early in the pandemic, spring 2020. And this sums up the situation which BSO PaLS finds itself in, and it's illustrative of what we've heard from many procurement professionals in this module so far. In particularly at point 3, it says you're inundated with offers in quotation marks of help. Were those offers useful, or were they a distraction to the work of procurement teams at that time?
No, we ended up, I think we got about 2,000 approaches from different companies. There was a number of duplicates coming into different people, so once those were weeded out, I think we had about 1,200 approximately. And having gone through the triage process, we actually got about 45 really useful leads out of that.
Thank you. Thank you. You can have that off the screen. And you've mentioned that some of those offers and referrals came through senior politicians, perhaps senior civil servants, and that they were all inputted into this contact log.
Yes.
This module has heard at length from other witnesses involved in procurement in UK central government about the operation of a high priority lane, or what has sometimes been called a VIP lane, where offers were referred in by senior politicians and repeatedly chased by either those politicians or the potential supplier. Was there an equivalent situation in Northern Ireland?
No, I can confirm that we would have logged all offers of help went through that triage process, and I think our logs would demonstrate that. And it was quite a rigorous process that was applied equally to everyone.
And did you have instances of senior politicians or other VIPs, if I can put it that way, chasing up referrals or offers of PPE or other equipment?
Well, we would have had instances where politicians certainly would have alerted us to particular companies of interest, and you know, but in effect, those went on to the log and would have been subject to the same checks and balances as any other. And not all of them would have been successful.
How were those offers in the contact log prioritised? How would you decide which to deal with first?
Well, it came in as a sequential basis, as I say, bar anything that was FFP3 related, and we had a separate triage stream which prioritised the offers of help for FFP3 in particular.
So it was otherwise first in, first served?
Otherwise first in, first served.
Thank you. You have said in your witness statement that there were two main differences in terms of procurement during the pandemic. The first is that price was not always as important as availability. And the second was the lack of open competition. We're going to come to deal with that at a later stage. But you also say that if an offer was considered to have potential in respect of availability, there was then a process that it went through in terms of testing and quality assurance. Can you explain what that was?
So in the early stages, that process of testing and quality assurance would have, so it's a multi-agency approach. So very early on, there was a process established with the Medicines Optimisation and Innovation Centre, which would have looked at the testing and certification of products that were offered to us and confirmed that they met CE standards, etc. So that process happened, and then later on, following a rapid review that the Minister had initiated, and some early problems with a contract with NHS Wales, where we had issues about user preference and acceptance, the silver command structures. So we had a sort of structure of gold, silver and bronze command, gold being at departmental level, silver being at the various organisations level. So the Health and Social Care Board established a silver cell with really infection and prevention and control people to look at acceptability and usability, etc. as well. So those kind of triage processes were very useful in terms of, because they were done prior to contract being awarded. And that was definitely a real learning point for us, because they weeded out a lot of the offers that were unsuitable. And then once we had placed orders, we knew that level of acceptability, both at a technical level and user level, was in place.
So you mentioned a couple of things that I want to clarify there. The first is the rapid review of PPE. I believe that was in April 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And that was commissioned by the Minister for Health. Yeah. And this led to what you have set out and other witnesses have set out as the product review protocol. And is that what you've described as this multi-agency approach involving, on the one side, the technical assurance from the Medicines Innovation and Optimisation Centre, and on the other side, user acceptability?
Yes, so there's a specific cell
Yeah.
established at the Silver Command level, independent of PaLS, who in effect took samples. So samples would have been provided and they would have gone through quality and user acceptance, and that was really influenced by some of the experiences we'd had with the NHS Wales contract, where we had sourced a face mask that met all the technical standards, but the user preference, and I think I have to put this into context. users were very frightened at this point in the pandemic. They had been used to specific types of product, and we'd standardised, for example, on 3M masks for the FFP3. You know, anything that was new, and it was inevitable that some things were new because we were having to source such a wide variety of different suppliers. So anything that was new was very, you know, they were unused to it. There was a lot of fear about whether or not they would be protected accordingly. So really that came off the back of that experience with Wales, the strengthening of the protocol, and we euphemistically refer to it as the three-legged stool, and it really meant that products had that very, very rigorous assessment prior to any orders being placed.
And if we can just go into that procurement, that specific procurement you mentioned from NHS Wales. We heard a little bit about this from the Welsh perspective yesterday in the witness evidence of Jonathan Irvine from NWSSP, the NHS Wales Shared Service Partnership. And what he described and what you also describe in your witness statement is that NHS Wales, or NWSSP, had secured a volume of type 2R masks, which is the blue surgical masks, yes. I believe, yes, some of which they could offer to BSO PaLS for Northern Ireland. And I understand from your witness statement and also from his evidence that the problem when those masks arrived in Northern Ireland was not that they failed any technical specification, but instead it was a matter of user preference. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. So, as I say, our staff had been very used to a metal strip, and this had a plastic strip and was felt not to be as malleable.
So
that's the word.
It doesn't create as tight a seal.
Well, that was the perception from staff. As I say, it had been assessed through. At this point, this was prior to the MOIC and the three-legged stool arrangement. So it had been assessed by Wales' own laboratories.
So it was technically
perfect, yeah, but just did not meet the user preference.
And you say that this amounted to 2% of all face masks purchased during the period of the pandemic. And do you recall how much that contract was worth?
I think it was, from memory, well, not from memory, I have a figure here and it's an approximation, but roughly about 3.3 million.
So that's a very significant procurement. And what did you end up doing with those face masks?
In terms of what we did with them, we actually ended up having to donate to charity. The mask was deemed unsuitable for use by the trusts and withdrawn from service.
And you've already said that this highlights the importance of that second leg of the stool of the user acceptability assessment. Has there been any other lessons learned from that incident in BSO PaLS?
Really, the product review protocol was the major lesson learned from that, and you know, just I suppose the sense that on the wider systemic level, the whole systems level, the importance of having that user voice expressed through some mechanism.
And one further question on the product review protocol. You've already mentioned that it came out of the rapid review of PPE, which was commissioned in April of 2020. And you say that the product review protocol was applied from about May, but not formally approved until July. Why was that?
I'm not party to what the formal approval processes were at that point, but I know we were very actively, on the basis of the experience with Wales, working on that basis early on.
Thank you. I want to consider the issue of fit more widely. And we will also turn to look at modelling. But one of the points that you raise about modelling is that modelling did not at any stage indicate that there was a need to take into account variation of fit for different ethnic minorities or gender or religious observance by healthcare workers. Did you have any issues about that issue raised with you as BSO PaLS?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you seek any information from, for example, the IPC cell or the Health and Social Care Trusts from that?
No, so in respect of the modelling again was set up as a Silver Command modelling cell in its own right, and that was led by the Public Health Authority in Northern Ireland. I wouldn't be party to the kind of factors. I mean, I know there would have been some clinical input, looking at activity and gathering intelligence, I suppose, from the trusts. I wouldn't be privy to the methodology that was used to come to that modelling.
I also wanted to ask about the point you've already raised about the standardisation of certain products in Northern Ireland. In particular, in your witness statement, you mentioned the FFP3 mask. Is it the case that Northern Ireland essentially procured, prior to the pandemic, one brand of FFP3 mask for the whole of the health and social care organisations?
Yeah, and I think it's, again, this is very contextual, so public policy, procurement policy at that point was encouraging a policy of standardisation for value for money reasons. And clinicians had been engaged in the selection of that particular mask. It was chosen because it had a very, very high degree of fit testing success. It was a trusted product, and represented value for money then as well because of that standardisation approach.
So you could procure larger quantities and
yes.
deliver on economies of scale. And is it the case then that at the outset of the pandemic, there was only one type of FFP3 mask regularly in use in Northern Ireland, to the extent that any FFP3
well,
mask
certainly
was regular?
the most widely, yes, used.
And that almost everyone who required an FFP3 mask in Northern Ireland would only have been fit tested for that particular mask.
That's correct,
correct.
As I understand it.
And you then detail that the supply of that mask broke down and it became necessary to source other masks. Was that mask coming through NHS supply chain?
No, so the alternatives would have come from a variety of based on the sourcing strategy that I described earlier. So we would have gone to existing suppliers, we would have gone to new suppliers, we would have contacted leads that were given to us for FFP3 masks. So the situation was pretty acute with those particular masks. So all those various sourcing strategies were applied, and a variety then of masks came through that route.
And that would have necessitated fresh fit testing for each new type?
For every, as I understand it, yes. The particular masks have to be anytime there's a change. And I'm not a procurement expert, but I'm told that was the situation anytime there was a test.
And who provided fit testing for trusts?
So fit testing for trusts during, there had been regional, as I understand it, a regional approach was initiated in 2019, but hadn't completed by the time the pandemic hit. There had been some difficulties, I think, in getting engagement for what's called the contract adjudication group. And therefore, at that point, going into a full, open, competitive tendering position through COVID would have been counterproductive given the time that was in it. The need was to have the fit testing done at that point. So customers had to revert to existing arrangements which were either using their fit testers that they had trained locally, because it's a health and safety issue for the trust organisations, or indeed going out and awarding direct awards to existing fit test contractors.
It might be helpful at this point to look at what one of the trusts says about this. This is INQ 000514350, and at page 23, it's 24, excuse me, and paragraph 79. This is the witness statement of the South Eastern Health and Social Care Trust, and they're talking about the impact of BSO PaLS, of having to go out and procure their own fit testing contracts as opposed to those being arranged centrally by BSO PaLS. They set out a number of consequences, including lack of standardisation and controls testing, the potential impact on service delivery, obviously the stress and anxiety for the staff in having to be fit tested potentially a number of times, and obviously the increased administrative burden and cost, particularly given that a regional contract might have benefited from reduced price due to being a larger contract. And if we can also have a look at the Northern Ireland Audit Office report, this is INQ 003488882, and at page 15. Thank you. At paragraph 19, we see that the Health and Safety Executive in Northern Ireland expressed, the Royal College of Nursing expressed to the Health and Safety Executive in Northern Ireland that local fit testing was not widely available at that point. And it also observes that BSO PaLS did not procure centrally fit testing. And it says that it was more expedient for trusts to award their own direct award contracts for this service. Can you explain why it was considered more expedient at that point?
Probably referring back to what I said at the outset there. So there had been a process initiated in 2019 prior to the pandemic to actually try and agree a regional fit testing arrangement. That had not progressed due to lack of engagement in terms of the contract adjudication groups, and that's very important that they are the people who actually need to be involved in the tender process. So it wasn't, to have continued that on through the pandemic, we would have had to have been getting into standing up contract adjudication group, inviting tenders, evaluating tenders, that open competitive normal process. There wasn't the time in it, given the need to have fit testing done with these new masks for staff.
What about, was consideration given to BSO PaLS awarding a direct award contract or another accelerated procurement process for fit testing?
So that's what I'm talking about. It still would have had to have gone through, in terms of the fit testing contract, it was just deemed more expedient given the number of suppliers that were available. The sense from the procurement specialists was that if there had been some sort of a regional award to one supplier, for example, they would not have had the wherewithal to have coped with the amount of fit testing surge that was in Northern Ireland at the time.
And it's also noted in the Audit Office report that a regional fit testing framework is currently being developed. How has that progressed to date?
So that has now been put in place.
Okay. And is the standardisation that you mentioned earlier, is that still occurring in procurement?
There's certainly, as I understand it, yes, we've gone back to primarily using 3M masks.
Thank you. We can have that off the screen. I want to turn to look at modelling more generally. You have said in your evidence that the WN COVID supply chain cell group, which you've already mentioned as being a 4 nations group to respond to supply chain issues, it was identified that reasonable worst case modelling was being worked up by NHS England at that point at the very end of January in 2020. And requests were made, I understand, on a number of occasions throughout February and March from devolved administration members for modelling to enable demand planning to take place. And you note that the group ceased to exist by the end of March and no central modelling was ever forthcoming through that group. Did you ever receive that modelling?
We did not.
Do you know why?
I have no insight into that.
And instead, you say that BSO PaLS had to rely on the demand patterns emerging from warehouses, but that was obviously not very indicative because it wasn't predictive of anything. It was just telling you what was happening at the time, and that it couldn't create an impression of what demand you would have in the future. However, later, there was modelling that came through the Department of Health and Social Care when you were asked to provide data on PPE demand on the 27th of March 2020. There's then a model that was worked up that set out modelling for hospital-based care in 3 different scenarios. How much did that delay until late March for any form of modelling hinder BSO PaLS' ability to procure sufficient PPE at that point?
Well, certainly at that point, that led to our first supply and demand type of situation, which was first published in April the 4th. So in terms of sort of, again, back to the sort of governance structures, there hadn't been a modelling cell stood up at this point. That particular piece of work done in March was led by the Health and Social Care Board and our public health colleagues coming together to really look at kind of the projections across those 3 scenarios and to understand where we were in terms of supply and to give us some sort of an indication of what we should be buying in terms of the various levels of PPE. Obviously, some of the orders had already been placed prior to that, and as you say, Ms. Gardner, that was very much just, we were working off demand that was coming into the system at that point. So it was adjusted. That particular one was adjusted fairly quickly, as well, following a change of guidance just immediately after that, for the needs of the independent sector and the domiciliary care sectors, and so community was then added to that particular piece of modelling. But it was still a very initial attempt at trying to create that demand modelling, and again that led to I suppose a realisation that there needed to be a more nuanced and sophisticated form of modelling. So a modelling cell was then established in Silver Command that actually produced a more informed model in June 2020 named reasonable worst case scenario.
And I think we'll come to that very soon, but I first want to address 2 issues with that initial set of modelling that you got, you say it was only focused at hospital-based care. To what extent could that be useful for BSO PaLS, given that health and social care in Northern Ireland has, and was at that time, had been for some time, integrated with social care?
It was obviously limited to that.
And you set out later that subsequent modelling reflected that community settings accounted for about 60% of the PPE that was expected, which gives us a sense of the impact of that omission from the first model.
And perhaps just, just to clarify, so the social care, health and social care, there would have been social care that would have been directly provided by the trusts in Northern Ireland. The addition of the community that we're talking about here then would have also included private sector community care. And
the further reasonable worst case scenario modelling that you mentioned, that was provided in June 2020 and then later again the next summer in 2021. And it assumed that the health and social care system would function as normal. So it used, I believe, the data from the previous year in 2019, as well as dealing with COVID cases. And then it provided a further buffer of 20% on modelled PPE demand. But are two things not obviously problematic from that? The first is that this is a reasonable worst case scenario. So we're saying this is probably as bad as it's going to get. And then you add an additional 20% on top of that, which is also seems quite high. Does this not obviously lead to over-purchasing at this stage?
Respectfully, BSO were instructed to use the modelling to procure, and I think this is the limits of the various cells. Between the first reasonable worst case scenario and the following one, we would have been indicating actual usage. That would have fed into the second set of modelling figures, but it did reflect, I suppose, a very conservative and prudent approach to modelling.
And coming to the quantity of surplus, you've set out that as of the 31st of March 2024, of the total volume of PPE procured, 2.72% of that has expired in storage. And is that it has expired and it has not been re-lifed or extended?
Yes.
Yes, so that has had to be disposed of?
Yes.
And of that PPE, there are 362 million individual items still in stock, although you note that 238 million of those are gloves, so they're not considered to be surplus stock because presumably the health and social care organisations will use those. They'll get through that stock. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the intent, it's a very fluid picture, the whole issue of there's various attempts to try and work with suppliers to re-life products as much as possible. Some of the PPE, as you rightly point out, will go on indefinitely, but there are, as time goes on, obviously there's a situation where some of it reaches end of life as well. So yes, that's a moving picture.
And indeed, you say that since 2022, March 2022, a BSO has already written off £15.9 million of surplus stock, and you've also made provision for future write-offs. You say that the most significant factor leading to this surplus stock was the accuracy of the demand modelling. What kind of feedback has been delivered to whether the modelling cell itself or those responsible for the modelling cell to ensure this doesn't happen in future?
That would have been pretty consistent in terms of feedback. So in terms of reflecting, I suppose, the picture of demand versus supply, a report was developed that actually reflected that planned modelling, the actuals, and the situation right across the province and what was anticipated to be coming in. And that was actually worked up and provided to all major stakeholders, including Trust Chief Executives, Silver Command, Gold Command, and the strategic supply cell that would have been established at Gold Command.
And one further point on modelling. We know that since June 2020, Northern Ireland has had a DPS set up in respect of PPE. That's noted in the Northern Ireland Audit Office report, though that report also notes that only 2 contracts had been awarded up until that point through the DPS. Is that reflective of the quantity of PPE that had already been procured at that point?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment.
And do you know, have any further contracts been awarded for PPE since the publication of that report?
I don't believe for PPE, but the dynamic process system is still in place.
So essentially, we're still working through some of that stock
Yes.
that we procured in that early stage
Yes.
prior to June 2020. Thank you. There are a few other points that I wanted to deal with before we finish in terms of lessons learned. And they also come from the Northern Ireland Audit Office report. One of the points that is observed in that report is that BSO PaLS had not identified any conflicts of interest in contracts awarded during the pandemic, and that's reflected in your evidence as well. You set out in your statement some reasons as to why conflicts of interest weren't an issue in Northern Irish procurement. Could you elaborate on some of those?
In terms, so yes, we would have had the standard declarations of interest. I think the fact that we had established the product review protocol, while it was primarily aimed at establishing the veracity of products, you know, the benefit of that in terms of you know, conflicts of interest, the fact that you had 3 multiple agencies involved before any contract was placed meant that, you know, in terms of conflicts of interest, even if someone had a particular you know, interest in something, they wouldn't have been able to have overridden that very independent set of 3 different organisations, and all of them having to have approved the order before it was placed.
So that's the fact that the decision doesn't rest with one person alone. You also talk about the annual conflicts of interest declarations that officials have to make. Given that we know there was a decent amount of procurement from local organisations, some of which repurposed facilities in order to make PPE or similar products, were staff reminded of the need to keep up to date those declarations,
Yes.
given they might be engaging with organisations, businesses that they wouldn't have anticipated to engage with in the course of procuring healthcare supplies?
Yes, there would be a fairly rigorous internal governance process about conflicts of interest, and indeed that would have extended right up to myself as Chief Executive. I would have been involved in some of those discussions as well at that point.
The caveat that's given in the Northern Irish Audit Office report is that while it is correct that no conflicts of interest were identified, the process that BSO PaLS has in place relies on those proactive declarations by officials, and therefore it's not going looking for any undisclosed conflicts. Have any changes to that process been implemented to ensure a more robust or proactive approach?
Not at this point. As I say, the fact that there was that multiple whole systems approach, I think, prevents that conflicts of interest process arising, to be honest. You know, I mean, our PALS team are very, very experienced professionals of long standing, you know, and have been are very much seen as a trusted partner. There would be that division, if you like, within the PALS structure itself as to who was placing orders and who was approving orders, etc. So it wasn't a case of it was all going through one person, and if one person had a conflict of interest, they had the ability to actually, you know, place an order the whole way through. And in fact, during the COVID period, anything that was deemed to be of high risk or a particular interest had to go through finance and had to go through chief executive and SMT information as well. So, you know, there was a real sense of scrutiny, I suppose.
The other point that is made in the NI Audit Office report is that fuller documentary evidence would have provided a more complete record and trail of important procurement decisions taken during the pandemic. You also note in your witness statement that BSO PaLS has accepted in full all of the Northern Ireland Audit Office's recommendations. What steps have been taken to implement the recommendation on fuller and more complete record keeping?
So that would have included documenting all our logs, all our processes, documenting flow diagrams and making sure that we had the appropriate evidence, if you like, alongside each step of those, making sure our DAX, direct awards processes, were documented and signed off appropriately, particularly at the chief exec level, and the rationales, and making sure things like contract award notices were actually issued in time, because some of those had been up to a week late during the pandemic.
Finally, in your witness statement, you say that you're not aware of any specific lessons learned reviews that have been carried out by BSO PaLS. Given the number of learning points identified in the Audit Office report, and indeed the very evident public interest in procurement of healthcare supplies during the pandemic, what consideration has BSO PaLS given to carrying out a more holistic review of lessons learned during the pandemic?
Okay, so there would have been a BSO-wide corporate lessons learned report that was actually collated through our Director of Legal Services. However, that would have been at a very high level corporately right across all of our services. And indeed, there was some work done in terms of the lessons actually being incorporated into PAL's own processes and continuity plans, but we absolutely accept that that there's a need to probably collate. I think we still feel that we're not really finished at the point where we could pull all of the lessons learned, because some of that will be about disposal, and some of the initiatives, for example, we're involved in at the moment in terms of putting them into energy and waste initiatives. So we want to make sure that it's a full picture before we actually do a final lessons learned. But happy to take any recommendations that the inquiry makes to us in that respect.
Thank you. My lady, those are all my questions. I believe there are 20 minutes of questions from core participants. We usually take a break, but I'm in your hands as to whether you want to proceed.
Miss Bailey, are you okay to come back at past for another 20 minutes?
I'm content, my lady.
Sure, thank you very much. In which case, we'll break till past.
Thank you.
Please.
Ms. Gardner, I think it's Miss Bunton first.
Yes.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. I ask questions on behalf of the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations, FEMHO, and during the early stages of the pandemic, the urgency of the situation led to significant challenges in PPE procurement, including periods when purchases were made without formal quality control. This situation presents concerns regarding the potential distribution of substandard or even fraudulent PPE to frontline workers, which FEMHO is particularly concerned about given the risks to healthcare workers, especially those from ethnic minority backgrounds who were disproportionately affected. Just want to ask two questions. The first question being, the product review protocol was only formally introduced in July 2020, months after large-scale PPE procurement had already taken place. During this time, were substandard or fraudulent PPE items distributed to frontline workers? And what specific risks did this delay create?
Thank you. I think it would be really important to state that while the three-tiered product review protocol didn't formally begin until the period you've talked about, that we had been working with MOIC almost from the very start of the pandemic in respect of technical assessment of products. So I think I don't think we would accept that any substandard products in terms of not meeting the technical assessments set out at policy level by the national sort of standards weren't met. Those processes would have been very thoroughly checked by the MOIC staff. Our sense was that anything that we bought met the criteria that was established for technical quality.
Right. The second question. Prior to May 2020, PPE purchases were made without formal quality control. Given this gap, was any retrospective review conducted to assess whether earlier procurement contained fraudulent or unsafe products? And if not, why not?
So again, while I say the product review protocol was endorsed formally, really it from the experience with Wales, we had been working with MOIC in terms of technical assessment, but very early on started working with the infection prevention cell to actually, and infection prevention staff at trust level to make sure that it was very much around user acceptability and preference rather than the quality assessment against technical standards.
Right. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Banton. Ms. Campbell, I think you're up next.
Thank you, my lady. Ms. Bailey, I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland Bereaved COVID Families for Justice, or COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. Some of my questions have already been touched on, others in fact have been asked, and I'll cut my cloth accordingly. But I wanted to start, please, with asking you questions about the decision-making process in procurement, and to look at one email chain in particular. Can I have, please, INQ 000 503883? There we are. And can we go to the very bottom of this email chain and perhaps have a look at where it starts on the 19th? To put it in context for you, Ms. Bailey, this is the 19th of March 2020. And we'll, of course, remember that this was a very panicked time a few days before we entered into lockdown and so on. But we can see at 8 minutes to 6 on the 19th of March, the Minister for Health, Mr. Swan, receives an email from a company that promises to supply, or a potential to supply, 20,000 ventilators over a 6-week period, which are approved for the EU and our manufacturer already supplies to the NHS. And so just to put that in context, we're just before 6 o'clock in the evening, and if we can zoom out, please, and just scroll up. Mr. Swan, at the very bottom of the page, a few minutes later, sort of 10 minutes later, I think, forwards the email on to his private office suggesting, and also to the CMO suggesting that this may be worth a follow-up. And then if we can go to the middle of the next page, please. So the very bottom, I'm so sorry, the very bottom of that page, 19th of March. We're now just 4 minutes past 11 in the evening, so this is really happening between what's normal close of business and 11 p.m. The CMO writes, Liam, consider full approval and please proceed with procurement. Please accept this email as confirmation. Deborah and I will square away. So we have a period of a matter of hours where this email comes in with a promise of 20,000 ventilators. And by 11 o'clock that evening, the CMO is indicating that you should consider full approval, not you personally, but there should be a consideration of full approval and proceed with procurement. Is it fair to read this email as the CMO giving his full approval for purchase of those ventilators for that source? Is that a fair interpretation?
Upon investigation of receiving this email chain, what I can confirm is that we checked our logs in terms of this particular referral.
Yes.
It was logged through the normal triage process that we have, and the decision was that we would not be proceeding with the suggested product was not fit for use, didn't proceed. Right. Now, the other thing that we have checked, and we believe, and Milady, we're happy to confirm this at a later stage, is we believe the business case, and if you look at the timings, the business case that is referred to here was a business case that was already developed on behalf of the HSCB for purchase of ventilators.
Yes.
And had been in track already, that was with the Critical Care Network of Northern Ireland, to procure ventilators. So that business case had already been, that was a completely different business case. I appreciate reading the email. There's confusion because you're not quite clear what business case, but that business case would not, there's no way a business case would have been developed between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock that night. So when we checked back, there was a business case being developed at that point on behalf of the HSCB for ventilators, and we believe that that's the approval that is being talked about here.
Understood. I think the focus of my question is slightly different, Ms. Bailey. On the one hand, there was a business case for ventilators, and we can all understand why. On the other hand, this email, although it seems to have attracted the approval of the CMO, ultimately didn't lead to the purchase from that supplier. And in fact, open source would suggest that that supplier wasn't even incorporated on business, on government house or company's house at the time that the email was sent. But in his own statement, the Chief Medical Officer indicates that he had no direct role in procurement and was not a key decision maker in respect of procurement, okay? But if we look at this email, and perhaps we can just focus in again, right in the middle of the page, at the email at 5:29 in the morning, the title, in fact, of that email at the point at which it's forwarded has changed. CMO approval for BSO procurement of ventilators and PPE. So far as you were concerned, or are concerned, what role did the CMO have in approving the procurement of ventilators as opposed to the need for ventilators?
I would need to come back to the inquiry on that basis.
It's important, I think, that I should make clear that I'm not suggesting that the CMO's intentions were anything other than honourable and indeed urgent. But is there some evidence in this email chain that the procurement system was not immune to outside influence given this CMO approval for the procurement of ventilators?
Well, it would have been standard, I believe, that if a business case was actually developed and sent through to the department for approval, it would be the department who would be approving the business case. So, in that respect, I would have no qualms about departmental health approval for a business case. I am not familiar with the statement that the CMO had no part in that.
Do you have any qualms about an email that seems to develop between 6 o'clock in the evening to 11 o'clock of an evening approving procurement as a...
No, because as I say, I don't believe that email chain was approving procurement of the particular issue that was being raised, the North NWT. I think it was referring to an already developed business case that had been through the requisite processes in silver, and we were asking for gold approval, I believe, was the intention. And perhaps that could be best explored with the Department of Health.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll move on to my next topic, and it's been touched on to some extent in terms of the availability and adequacy of PPE. You've addressed in your statement and in your evidence the need to source alternative FFP3 masks, and we understand the reasons why, and the complication then that ensued in terms of not having the standard masks that were ordinarily available throughout the trusts, because staff had to be refit tested for each alternative mask. The inquiry has statements, as you can imagine, from, and you may well have seen them, from the trusts. And the Belfast Trust identifies that when less than 1% of staff within the trust had just been incorrectly fit tested, so we're not talking about a need to completely refit test, but just less than 1% having been incorrectly fit tested for an available product, the ripple effect on the number of staff ultimately affected was 1,385 members of staff. Were you or was BSO PaLS aware of that really significant impact of refit testing or newly fit testing percentages of frontline staff?
We would have certainly been aware that every time a variation in mask was introduced, that there was a need to refit test staff. Certainly wouldn't have been aware of that level of detail, and it was an inevitability, if you like, of having to source those variations in product, that the fit testing had to be recarried out.
I mean, might it have been important to know the ripple effect, that we're not just talking about the consequences on staff having to go and be refit tested, it's the other staff that are also affected. And if you're looking at 1,385 members of staff across just one trust in relation to one fit test, surely BSO PaLS should have been aware of that type of figure.
Well, certainly it comes down to almost, there's something here about risk appetite in terms of where we were at the time in terms of sourcing the FFP3 masks. It was a really, really critical situation. The procurement and sourcing staff, I mean, we're talking about a situation where we knew that we had to get these masks, particularly for COVID wards, etc., and aerosol generating procedures. These were our own family and staff that we were trying to protect. So the real priority was to actually try and get the FFP3 mask. And I'm not saying, and I'm absolutely sympathetic to the fact that incurred a retesting implication. Absolutely. I think, but the priority at that point was actually making sure that staff were adequately protected on the wards.
Given the very significant impact, has BSO PaLS considered whether it could have done more to mitigate the consequences of changing masks or sourcing alternative masks?
I really feel, in the situation that was in it at the time, there really wasn't very much alternative. As I said, the priority was to actually secure the masks to allow the staff to carry out their work. We would all have been very aware of, Spotlight programme and the kind of fear and situations that staff were in terms of those aerosol generating procedures. So the absolute priority from a risk point of view was to secure the masks and allow staff to carry out their work.
Yeah, you've touched on it just in that answer, and indeed in your answers to questions from Mr. Gardner earlier this morning, that these new masks and refit testing were all occurring at a time of really heightened anxiety for staff. And we know that it also happened in combination with regular changes in PPE guidance. Which led, according to really all the trusts, and the Belfast Trust reference to their statement in particular, which led to a reduction in confidence in staff that the PPE they were receiving was really providing them with optimum protection. To what extent was BSO PaLS made directly aware of the impact on confidence at the time of trying to source the alternatives?
Yeah, no, we would have had some awareness. For example, the PHA had done their 10,000 Voices report, and there was a sense, and actually very interesting if you read that report, there was a sense of, where the equipment met technical specifications and where it was available. Even with that, there was a sense of not quite trusting and not quite being confident. So you could meet as many technical specifications, many quality assurance as you like. The fear that staff had was that, and so we would have been aware of that. And indeed, that sense of perception, I think, is something that in any lessons learned, we'd have to be very mindful of the confidence and perceptions of staff.
And bearing in mind the difficulties that you were having with sourcing a consistent, the one consistent mask, did BSO PaLS consider what it might do in terms of communicating with the trusts and therefore with staff, why it was that you were having these difficulties, why these masks were suitable alternatives and did offer protection that was required?
There would have been very regular communication through both the gold, silver, bronze command and control structures, and indeed there was a supply cell, operational cell that would have operated with the trusts on a daily basis. And it is my understanding that the rationale for why we were having to source alternatives was highlighted and discussed at those meetings, and indeed at an operational level with the trust providers. So, as I say, we were really between a rock and a hard place in terms of trying to make sure that we actually got the supply of the very, very critical PP3. And certainly that was communicated out. It was, as I say, an inevitability that we had to refit test, and unfortunately that was the consequence.
And finally, just moving on to my final, if you like, subtopic. Again, you've touched on it in terms of the consequences of different body types, face shapes, ethnicity, religious observance, and so on of our frontline staff. And the fact that the demand modelling provided didn't at any stage indicate variations of this nature, which is perhaps surprising given the demographics of those staff on whom the health and social care system relies. Again, using the trust statements as a reference, on the whole, it would appear that at trust level, there wasn't really any adequate or any analysis of the characteristics of staff members who had been incorrectly fit tested or who were failing fit tested. It was just a simple pass or fail. So if the trusts didn't undertake an analysis of the characteristics of staff who failed to fit test, is it fair to assume that this is one reason why your demand modelling might not have indicated variations of that nature?
Perhaps. I would be speculating, frankly, to say any comment on that. I think that's best directed towards the trusts and to the infection and prevention cell.
Well, so far as BSO PaLS is concerned, was it the case that throughout the pandemic, the demand modelling and the purchasing didn't take into consideration variations in face types?
What we did do was try and base our buying on historical patterns of usage, and that in itself would have accounted for some, I suppose, variation. The fit testing process itself is very specific to facial. To individual faces. The other thing that we did when we onshored production of some of the FFP3 masks was we did actually make an effort with one particular supplier to get a particularly small fit or FFP3 mask produced, and that ensured a very, very high pass rate for smaller faces.
And looking forward, is the variation in face types, in religious practices and beards and so on, is that something that BSO PaLS is cited on in order to inform future ordering and modelling?
Again, respectfully, that would be health and safety considerations at the trust level to make sure that that staff or those kind of variations are accounted for. The role of PaLS would be to buy to the specification that would be coming through from our customer organisations.
Thank you very much. My lady, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Campbell. That concludes the questions that we have for you. Thank you very much for your help. And if you could, perhaps with the assistance of colleagues, answer any of the issues that you said you could come back to us on, I'll be really grateful.
I will indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms Gardner.
My lady, the next witness is Chris Matthews.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want an affirmation?
Yes, please.
Do you repeat after me?
Okay.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare
declare and affirm
and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
and
nothing
nothing
but the truth. Thank you.
Could you please state your full name for the inquiry?
Chris Matthews.
Thank you. Mr Matthews, you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry already. That is the corporate witness statement on behalf of the Department of Health in Northern Ireland. It runs to 129 pages and it's dated the 5th of February and it is INQ 000521964. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr Matthews, you are the Deputy Secretary for Resources and Corporate Management. Is that correct?
Corporate governance, but yes.
Corporate governance, thank you. And that means that you are also the Executive Board member with responsibilities for BSO, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Yes. For that reason, you've given the corporate statement on behalf of the Department of Health.
Yes.
But I understand that you were only posted to that role on the 25th of April, 2022.
That's right, yeah.
But you have familiarised yourself with events over the entire period, and you are content to speak to the extent of your knowledge
Yes.
to that period. Thank you. It might be helpful at the outset to address some of the issues pertaining to the structure and the systems of procurement in Northern Ireland and actually also of its healthcare system that are particularly unique to or particularly characteristic of Northern Ireland. We have heard in Ms Bailey's evidence and also Mr Losty's evidence so far about health and social care in Northern Ireland. We have heard that you represent the Department of Health, and that Mr. Losty represented the Executive Office, and that Ms. Bailey represented the Business Services Organisation, and specifically Business Services Organisation PaLS.
Yeah.
Could you please, as briefly as possible, explain what some of those acronyms mean and how they relate to one another?
Okay, so if we start with the Executive Office, that is essentially the kind of office that supports the First and the Deputy First Minister. It has like a number of administrative functions. Probably most relevant to this discussion is around the civil contingencies function. BSO is the Business Services Organisation, which is an arm's length body of the Department of Health. And PaLS is a unit within BSO, and it's the Procurement and Logistics Service for Northern Ireland, for the Northern Ireland Health Service.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And when we speak about health and social care, Northern Ireland, to what extent does that body exist? In what form does it exist? And how does it relate to the Department of Health?
So the HSC is really a kind of term of art. It doesn't have a kind of a legal or sort of corporate existence. It's made up of primarily 5 health and social care trusts and a number of arm's length bodies. The PHA, which I think the Public Health Agency, which I think has already been talked about today, and the BSO being some examples of that. There are other bodies, the Patient Client Council, for instance, off the top of my head, but the HSC is not, it's just a term we use to kind of collectively describe the trusts and the sort of ALBs.
But there is a Health and Social Care Board, so what's that do?
There was a Health and Social Care Board, yes. So the Health and Social Care Board, which was in existence at the time of the pandemic, was the Commissioner of Services. So in essence, it sort of would set out at the start of every year what services were being purchased on behalf of the Department of Health. During the pandemic, the Health and Social Care Board was dissolved and was absorbed into the department as the strategic planning group within the department. So it's now part of the department. The functions are broadly similar to what they were during the pandemic, but the HSCB now no longer exists.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship between the Health and Social Care Trusts on one hand and the Department of Health on the other?
So the social care trusts are the bodies which provide health and social care operationally for Northern Ireland. They are creatures of statute. They're created by the relevant sort of legislation for the health service. The Department of Health funds them and also then has sponsorship responsibility. So one of my responsibilities in my role is as corporate sponsor for the trusts as well.
Mm-hmm. And we heard from Ms. Bailey a little bit about this, but could you also explain or elaborate on the relationship between BSO PaLS and the Department of Health, particularly as it relates to kind of lines of accountability?
Yes. So in brief, the BSO is accountable through their board to the department, and the accounting officer, who is the permanent secretary, is my direct boss.
And what involvement does the Department of Health itself have in procurement, or is that all delegated to BSO PaLS?
Broadly, yes. So occasionally the department will procure in the event that we're doing something sort of novel or interesting. So, for instance, at the minute, we're looking at the use of AI in certain circumstances, and we may do the procurement ourselves on that. But generally speaking, when you're talking about equipment and services for the health service at large, that's done through PaLS.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of ministerial accountability for procurement decisions, we heard from Ms. Bailey that there are potentially 2 lines of accountability, one to the Minister for Health and one to the Minister for Finance. Does that reflect your understanding as well?
Yes. So the BSO is accountable to the department on the basis of its performance and its expenditure. The accountability to DOF, as I understand it, is around their status as a COPE, which that's not awarded by the Department of Health. We don't have the competence to do that. That's a separate function of Department of Finance.
And as you've set out in your statement, the permanent secretary of the Department of Health is also the accounting officer.
Yes.
Is that correct? And you set out the details of a number of different organisations that were set up during the pandemic to assist with procurement of healthcare supplies and equipment. One was the PPE strategic cell, excuse me.
Yes.
And you also stood up the Gold Command structure. What were those two bodies? What were they intended to do? What did they end up doing?
Okay. So if we start with the Gold Command Cell, that is just the kind of the standard structure as part of a civil contingencies response, and it is essentially the sort of strategic mind coordinating the emergency response to the pandemic. The PPE supply cell was specifically spun off of Gold Command to focus on the PPE issues that were kind of emerging from the system, particularly from the kind of exponential growth in demand, and then the lack of clarity in those early stages as to, well, how are we as a system going to manage this kind of novel and unexpected demand for PPE?
And you also mention the roles of the CMO, the CNO, and the CPO, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer in particular was the head of the Medical Supplies Cell.
Yes.
Was that a body that was in existence prior to the pandemic, or was it stood up?
No,
for
that
the
was
pandemic?
part of the
Yes.
pandemic response.
And what role did it play in the pandemic response?
And so overall, I think its main function was to ensure the continued supply of key pharmaceuticals. Specifically in this kind of instance, it looked at oxygen, and it, I think, helped through the MOIC group with the quality assurance of PPE, and on the technical side of PPE.
So that would have been the involvement in the system of technical and quality assurance.
Yes,
that
the quality
described.
assurance of the technical data that I think came with any proposal for PPE.
Thank you. You also say, however, that the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer did not have any direct role in procurement through that, and that cell didn't have a direct role in procurement.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
One comment that you have also made, which it might be helpful to expand on as it gives context to the situation which you found yourselves in March 2020, is in your witness statement at paragraph 3. You say the system here is believed to be too small to support a fully fledged market, and the emphasis has been on commissioning as a means of developing and promoting reform and modernisation.
Yes.
You also notice you note the small size of the private sector in healthcare.
Yes.
How do you consider that the size of the system has an effect on the healthcare?
Yes. So I think this is in the sense that most people would understand commissioning, and I think certainly in the sort of in larger jurisdictions, commissioning would often also then take a sort of a more critical role in terms of thinking about decommissioning some services and expanding others. In Northern Ireland, commissioning hasn't tended to be in that space because there aren't the sort of viable alternatives for services that you would find in other jurisdictions. So what we call commissioning in Northern Ireland would probably not be understood as commissioning in other jurisdictions. It is, so in terms of service development and innovation, as we say, that's more where commissioning is lied in sort of developing services and growing services.
And another point that you make, which is somewhat similar, is in relation to the Department of Health's role as a lead government department. How is that different from what our understanding of the function of a lead government department might be in relation to Westminster, for example?
Yeah. I suppose the most basic limit is that we can't sort of direct or instruct across departmental lines. We have direct control over the department itself. The department is a sort of statutorily defined set of functions, and the minister has control of those functions and no others. And therefore, in the sense of leading a cross-departmental or cross-governmental response, that has to be done through cooperation as opposed to any power given to the department to direct or to direct the use of resources from other departments.
And you described in your statement, and indeed other witnesses have as well, a number of situations where, in particular, the Department of Health and the Department of Finance and the Executive Office have worked together on particular procurements, but also issues generally relating to procurement.
Yeah.
So that clarification about the lead government department categorisation is helpful. Mr. Losty, in his evidence last week, also noted that the need for cooperation between departments and between ministers.
Yeah.
And to that end, he observed one of the unique features of the Northern Irish system, which is that you have ministers from different, indeed sometimes opposing parties, who have to work together collaboratively over a problem like the pandemic. His observation was that at time led to friction or delay that might not have been present in other systems. Does that reflect your understanding of what happened during the pandemic?
I suppose because I have no contemporaneous knowledge of how things were going from my review of the material. The things that we needed to get done broadly got done. So if there was friction, it's not obvious from the outcomes, if that makes sense.
And again, one other aspect of the health system which is peculiar to Northern Ireland, you set out in your witness statement that for a very considerable period of time between the 2nd of March 2017 and the 11th of January 2020, there was no Minister for Health in Northern Ireland. And just as context, how does the health system work in that scenario?
So a set of functions are given to a permanent secretary, but they're very limited and have been, because it's quite a novel area of law as well, it's often tested in courts exactly where the boundaries are drawn. Generally speaking, departments are unable to make major changes during a period of suspension, and they won't be able to legislate either because there's no legislature. So it in effect limits to a degree what departments are able to do.
And you note in your statement that you haven't identified any particular issues where that lack of an executive up until the 11th of January 2020 impinged on decision-making in relation to procurement. But culturally, when a civil service is more used than not to functioning without ministerial involvement, what impact does that have on the day-to-day running when you do have a minister, perhaps after a long period of time of not having one?
From my experience, generally speaking, people welcome the return of ministers. It brings back the sort of purpose of the department. So when ministers return, it generally just gives you more options for how you approach issues.
Mm-hmm. And finally, on the role of Department of Health, particularly in relation to procurement, what role does the Department of Health have in relation to approval of direct award contracts?
So we are required to approve above threshold contracts for EU tenders. So there are delegated limits. I think the number is 139,000 would have to come to the permanent secretary for approval.
Mm-hmm. And in relation to approval of spending limits, was that varied in any terms during the pandemic?
So I think there was a period where the then permanent secretary agreed a set aside purely for pandemic-related expenditure for a brief period. It's in my statement. I can't quite remember the dates, but for a matter of months where specifically those things related to COVID spending were delegated to trusts and ALBs.
And presumably that was for reasons of expediency and urgency.
Yes, it was to essentially to avoid clogging up the decision-making apparatus inside the department.
And where a decision is referred up from BSO PaLS to the department for approval, whether that's to do with spending limits or direct award contracts, what sort of scrutiny does that receive and by whom?
Yeah, so in brief, the relevant business area will consider the proposal, will think about the value for money sort of implications of it, whatever the operational implications are of not doing it, whether there are any alternatives that the relevant ALB ought to think about, and then they will provide that advice to the permanent secretary for their agreement or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And is there any ministerial involvement in those decisions?
I don't think so, no, and not for DACs.
And finally, on that topic, you will be aware of the Northern Ireland Audit Office report into the procurement of PPE during the pandemic.
Yes.
One of the recommendations, which, as I understand it, both BSO PaLS and the department have accepted in full, is to create less reliance on direct award contracts and
Yes.
urgent emergency procurement in any future pandemic. What plans have been implemented or are going to be implemented by the department for more flexible procurement routes in any future health emergency?
Sure. So as you know from Karen's evidence, DPS was instituted during the pandemic. So that's one part of any solution. Obviously, it depends on what needs to be procured. There will be novel circumstances that are difficult to predict. The department will work with BSO. At the moment, I chair a sort of regional procurement board where we consider a range of issues in terms of procurement that are both business as usual and any other things that emerge. It's just generally better practice to reduce the number of DACs. So it's a kind of a constant thing. And we have an audit and risk committee who is also very keenly paying attention to DACs. So it's a thing that we kind of work on constantly, and we are reluctant to award DACs if we can avoid it. In some cases, unfortunately, it is unavoidable.
I want to turn to look at the PP strategic supply cell in a bit
Sure.
more detail. You set out that this was established by the Health Gold Command on the 23rd of March in 2020. What organisations had a seat at that table, essentially, and how did they coordinate the various bodies involved in procurement?
So it was primarily officials within the department. So I think the officials were drawn from what was the transformation of the health service, and their remit really was to kind of carry out the functions of the lead department, that sort of coordination across government. So both into Whitehall with Department of Finance, with TEO, to kind of synthesize the various signals and communication coming from across the system into a set of recommendations for Gold Command. And that was, I think, the main relationships and points of communication were between BSO PaLS, DOF, and DOH, coordinated by the PP supply cell.
And you say that around about the time the strategic supply cell was set up, various issues were being escalated within the department and in particular from trusts and from community care settings, including settings which would normally source their own PPE.
Yeah.
About availability of PPE.
Yes.
What level of visibility did the PPE strategic supply cell have of levels of PPE in those settings, or was it just receiving ad hoc reports?
I think initially it would probably have been ad hoc reports from BSO. Over time, that became much more systematic, and I think there were a number of iterations of the sort of supply-demand type situation, and the reporting got much more effective quite quickly. However, absent of that, there was always this sort of silver gold command route. So it wasn't that the signals didn't come in, it was just that they weren't, at the start, as with many other things, the signals were coming from all over the system, and then were sort of being channeled by silver command to gold. Because the PPE supply cell was a gold level body, there was never any risk really that the PPE issues were not going to be visible at the highest levels of decision making.
One of the matters that was overseen by the PPE Strategic Supply Cell was the implementation of the recommendations published in the Rapid Review of PPE.
Yes.
The Rapid Review, you tell us, was commissioned on the 15th of April by the Minister for Health. Can you say why it was commissioned?
Yes, in essence, to try and get a kind of strategic sense of what was happening in the system and what kinds of things we ought to do as a system to get better control over the PPE situation.
Why was it not until mid-April that such a programme was undertaken, when we know from your evidence and the evidence of others that there were concerns about PPE supply much earlier in the year than that?
I would have to speculate, and I'm not really sure. None of the documents I reviewed sort of set out why that was done at that time.
That's fine, thank you. We know from that review that there were 19 recommendations made for kind of short-term improvement of the PPE position in Northern Ireland, and that led to 17 actions, 12 of which were critical and 5 of which were essential, and that informed different periods of time for implementation.
Sure.
I'm not going to take you through each of them because that would take a very long time. But there were 2 actions which took longer to resolve than the others. One was in relation to the appropriateness of the reuse of personal protective equipment, and that is something which this module has heard about from other witnesses, from other devolved administrations, and from UK central government.
Yeah.
And that was to do with a recommendation about the reuse of otherwise disposable single-use personal protective equipment in a period of critical shortage. And you say that took longer to close, despite being an essential recommendation. What was the reason for that, and what was the conclusion?
So, as I understand it, it was the work was done by PHA to examine the sort of risks and so on of reusing PPE. In the event, it was decided we weren't going to have to use PPE. I think there was generally a sense that if you could avoid doing that, you should. And then, because we were in a situation where we didn't need to reuse PPE, it wasn't taken any further than that.
Thank you. The second action, which took longer to close than expected, was the recommendation that there be a development of systems to enable feedback from end users around the quality of PPE.
Yeah.
And that was across the health and social care system and the independent sector. And the idea of that was that it could inform procurement, and that was classified as a critical, meaning to be completed within 2 to 4 weeks action. Again, why did that take a bit longer to conclude, and when was it concluded, and what was the ultimate conclusion?
So I think that was one of the recommendations that was also not completed. It's not clear to me in the things that I've read. It was the piece of work was led by the PHA. Again, I might speculate that it was considered the existing systems for communicating these things were sufficient. I'm not sure that that's the case. But
that doesn't seem to follow from the fact it was a recommendation.
It was a recommendation, yeah. But it's not clear to me why the PHA never made a recommendation on how that should work. And so other than we had the PPE mail box that's the CNO side set up, but nothing in addition to that.
Yes, I want to look at the analysis of the feedback that was gathered through the PPE mailbox. That is INQ 000 11115. And thank you. And if we can go to paragraph 3. So this was not a response to that recommendation.
No.
Because, as you've already said, the rapid review was commissioned on the 15th of April. This PPE mailbox was announced on the 17th of April. So this was a separate exercise
Yes.
by the department to receive concerns from health and social care workers about PPE. And if we can go to slide 4. Thank you. At paragraph 10, this analysis sets out that there were 95 queries received by the mailbox, some of which required no response, but the rest of which have been segregated into 4 themes. Offers to supply PPE, concerns regarding access to PPE, concerns regarding the correct use of PPE, and concerns regarding quality and decontamination of some items of PPE. And if we can go to slide 5. Thank you. This is the breakdown or the discussion of some of those queries which were regarding access to PPE. And the summary that's given there at the 3rd bullet point is, in all cases, supplies were either found to be available or made available by the relevant trust contact. And there are a couple of examples given below, but it is noted that there were 15 queries, so those are just examples.
Sure.
In regard to that 3rd bullet point, the supplies were either found to be available or made available. There's quite a difference between the two, because it seems to accept that in some cases those concerns that there wasn't sufficient access to PPE were in fact justified, because ultimately the trust had to the department had to respond and make those supplies available. So is this accepting that there were instances within the health and social care system in Northern Ireland where staff did not have the correct PPE?
So I can't speak to any specific instance. What I understand is that in the early stages, even though there were sufficient supplies of PPE, because of the initial kind of pull system, some of the PPE was in sort of the wrong bits of the system and then had to be kind of moved to other areas.
So a distribution.
So I think it was a distribution and logistics problem rather than a supply problem in those kind of early stages where the demand was essentially exponential, and the system, I think as you've already heard, the business as usual system could not cope with the demands being placed on it at that point.
But from the perspective of a healthcare worker on the ground, they might not have had access.
In the things that I've seen, no specific instance has been referred to us, but I accept that it's a logical consequence of that situation.
I also want to look at what some of the Health and Social Care Trust witnesses have told us in their evidence. If we can go to INQ 000514028. This is the witness statement of Peter Watson on behalf of the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. Thank you. So he sets out that the type of mask which was available frequently changed. There was on occasion little or no notice that was going to happen. That had an impact on fit testing. And he also mentions that some of the masks received had been relifed, and we've heard a little bit about how that happened across the country. And those expired masks would have been had been extended. And then he also lists some concerns that the older masks did not afford as good a seal as newer masks, and that correlated with a higher fail rate. This is an issue which is raised in the analysis of the PPE mailbox as well. But the question is really, this sounds from the Belfast Health and Social Care statement like a systemic issue. We're told that the type of mask available frequently changed, that there were multiple instances of fit testing. And we also heard earlier from Ms. Bailey that that was almost an inevitability because of the reliance on a standard FFP3 mask prior to the pandemic, which then became unavailable. Is it fair to say that you would have expected to see more of this type of query in the PPE mailbox if it had been used more widely by health and social care workers?
It's difficult to say. I think on sort of reflecting on the decision to set up the mailbox, I think it was anticipated there would be more traffic than in effect there was. And I think the other thing about the mailbox is that the traffic dies off quite quickly as well. You know, even the relatively low number of queries drops quite rapidly over a couple of months. So it's difficult to kind of posit a hypothetical situation, but I think clearly, you know, from the evidence Karen has given and from just the reality of what it was like at the time, the uncertainty around PPE and the need to source alternatives definitely gave rise to these kind of situations where whether it's a genuine technical or safety problem or whether it's a perception because it's a piece of equipment that's unfamiliar to people, there was widespread concern about PPE, and I think that's reflected in a number of different places and is one of the issues that really sort of comes out for me with the sort of benefit of retrospectively looking at this stuff is around the sort of communication issue and the struggles that the system had in communicating messages to staff when they were competing with social media and sort of word of mouth and so on.
Yes, thank you. And that is relevant to the next document that I want to take you to. This is INQ 000325799. And if we can go to page 10 initially, just to explain what this document is. This is a document produced by the Public Health Agency that I believe you've seen. And it collates staff experiences of personal protective equipment over the initial phase of the pandemic, I believe up until December 2020. And it's called the 10,000 More Voice initiative in various places, and it aims to identify some common themes in terms of health and social care workers' concerns relating to PPE. If you can go to page 30. Thank you. So at the very bottom, we see some of the concerns that we've just been discussing about communication. So people saying it took weeks of form filling to convince people above us that PPE wasn't good enough. And this was time we didn't have and we were left feeling like our opinion didn't count. Months of complaint sheets about ill-fitting ear loop masks. And also concerns about reuse of PPE, quality of PPE, and throughout that document, there's a great deal of information and quotes from the people who participated about concerns which are reflected, but in small quantities in the PPE mailbox.
Sure. Yeah.
If we can go back to the PPE mailbox analysis, please. That's INQ 0004115. Thank you. And if we can go to page 6 or slide 6. Thank you. This again is the breakdown, the analysis of queries related to the issues just mentioned, so correct use of PPE and also quality and decontamination. So we see at the bottom there that quality issues and fitness for purpose were identified in 15 separate queries. And queries, in the first paragraph, there were 27 queries seeking information on correct type of PPE, which again goes to the issue of communication that you just raised. So bearing in mind that these are quite small numbers, there are only 95 queries in total received into the PPE mailbox. Only 15 of those were in relation to quality issues and fitness for purpose, which we know came up in other forms from the evidence of health and social care trusts, from the evidence of PHA. What action was taken to evaluate the use of the PPE mailbox and whether that was a particularly good way of measuring at the time the concerns of healthcare workers in relation to PPE?
I don't think, beyond the evaluation of the material received through the mailbox, I don't think there was any then follow-up evaluation of the utility of the mailbox itself. I suspect that some comfort was taken in how quickly the use of the mailbox dropped off, although you could argue that's false comfort, because you could say, well, people stopped using it because it didn't produce any, or maybe they didn't know about it, or I think one of the areas where we can take assurance from is that in the case of those queries around use of PPE and quality and so on, we were able to answer the questions that were being brought forward. And I think also it's probably accurate to say there was nothing new coming out of the mailbox that wasn't already coming into the system through other channels, and particularly through Silver Command around quality and the concerns around the usage of PPE. In talking to colleagues who were working in this area at the time, I think one of the issues that kind of became prevalent around the guidance was that there was a suspicion, an incorrect suspicion, that the guidance was being tailored around the availability of PPE as opposed to the sort of quality and safety elements of PPE. And that, I think, proved to be quite a difficult perception to shake over time.
So what action has been taken or is planned to be taken in the event of any future healthcare emergency in relation to making sure that those lines of communication are strong?
So at the time, I think the trust themselves had multiple different sort of initiatives that they tried. Departmental guidance was sort of refreshed and put out, and there were media messages and so on. I think for us, in a similar kind of situation, the communication strand, I think, will need to be strengthened. And I think in particular, the thing that I really sort of reflect on in looking at this material now is the kind of power of social media to override the kind of official guidance. Because it wasn't that there was no guidance, it was that there was enough kind of confusion in the sort of general environment and just enough ambient sort of concern that the official guidance wasn't quite having the impact that we would hope.
Thank you. Briefly, I want to look at modelling.
Okay.
We just discussed with Ms. Bailey her statement that the overstatement of demand from the reasonable worst case scenario modelling was, in her view, the biggest factor leading to surplus stock. And I just want to briefly look at the quantities of surplus.
Yeah.
That is INQ 000503893. Oh, apologies. That's not quite. That's the next one. INQ 000498841 is the quantities. Thank you. And these are the total quantities of what's considered surplus stock.
Yeah.
So we can see that that's a significant quantity at the bottom in totals, and we can see the breakdown according to type there.
Yeah.
which is also relevant when we consider the need to be agnostic as to what type of PPE might be required in a future
Sure.
scenario.
Yeah.
My first question is, does the Department of Health recognise that the factor that led to this large quantity of surplus was overwhelmingly demand, in the inflated demand predicted by the modelling that was provided at the time?
I don't know if I would say inflated demand. I would say the
Overstated, I think, is
yes,
the word that was used, yes.
the modelling overstated actual demand. Yeah, I think that's fair to say, yes.
Yeah. And how will that be prevented or catered for in the next emergency?
So I think there's a piece of work going on at the minute to look at modelling in general and to look at what lessons can be learned. And I think that will be important for us. And I think also we would look to any recommendations made by this inquiry around modelling. I think because it is fiendishly complicated, and you are dealing with, as you've seen some of the, the details that went into the modelling, there are a lot of variables that are essentially unpredictable at the time you make your projection. And we would certainly be interested in any techniques that would allow us to be more accurate in future.
And to that end, we heard a little from Ms. Bailey about the lack of demand modelling initially that was coming through from UK central government. Is there a need for greater collaboration in terms of modelling between UK central government and the devolved administrations?
I mean, I suspect that's probably generically true. I can't point to a specific point here. In terms of our modelling, we had two goes at it, really. We had an initial attempt and then a more sophisticated sort of dynamic model. It's probably just generically true that the more expertise you can bring to bear on something like this, the more likely you are to be accurate.
Thank you. My lady, those are all my questions. I believe the core participants have some as well.
Thank you. I think it's Miss Banton. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes. Oh, sorry, my computer's just... Right. Thank you, my lady. If I may just ask you some questions on behalf of FEMHO, which is the Federation of the Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Mr. Matthews, your insights into the challenges associated with PPE fit, particularly for ethnic minority healthcare workers, are crucial. The failure to incorporate demographic data into PPE demand modelling has raised significant concerns about the adequacy of protective equipment for these high-risk groups. Given the known disparities in PPE suitability, it's essential to understand the rationale behind these modelling decisions and the subsequent actions taken to address these critical fit issues. I've got 4 points, if I may. The first one is, why did the department not incorporate why did the department not incorporate demographic data, particularly ethnicity, into PPE demand modelling, given that certain groups, including ethnic minority healthcare workers, were at a heightened risk of fit testing failures?
In my review of the documents, it's not clear to me why that wasn't specifically included. What I would say is that everyone who was going to wear equipment was fit tested to make sure that it was suitable. In the event that a particular piece of equipment wasn't suitable, an alternative was found, or in some cases, I think the members of staff were moved to other duties where they wouldn't be exposed to risk. But I think I can accept, and I think there's a general issue in Northern Ireland, and the Executive Office is leading a piece of work on diversity and understanding more about the sort of complexion of Northern Ireland society. I accept that there is a gap that would need to be addressed in the future.
Right. What steps, if any, did the department take to ensure that PP procurement and distribution accounted for the differences in facial structures among frontline staff, particularly those from ethnic minority backgrounds?
So really the main, as I understand it, the main action taken was to fit test everybody to make sure that everyone who was using the equipment was protected by it.
Mm-hmm. Third point, shortages of FFP3 masks suitable for certain facial features were noted. Was there any correlation on grounds of ethnicity differences?
I have no information on that, I'm sorry.
And my last point, given that over 2,800 staff required retesting due to fit testing failures, was there any analysis conducted to determine whether ethnic minority staff were overrepresented in this particular group? And if not, why not?
So there was what's called a serious adverse incident review into the failure of fit testing in the cases I think you're referring to. Its conclusion broadly was that it was the application of a different protocol that caused the fit testing to fail, and not really anything to do with the characteristics of the individuals who were being tested.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your help. I'm very grateful, Mr. Matthews. I hope we haven't kept you from Northern Ireland for too long and your other duties. We shall adjourn now and return at 1:45. Thank you.
Thank you, my lady.